Howdy, everybody.
Howdy.
My name's Arthur, or Art, take your pick. And I hope you're ready for something completely different. Because today we're going to be talking about burnout. So this is me. I am a software engineer. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a neurologist. I get paid to write code. But I am a very avid hobbyist about learning what we are learning about the brain and taking those things and figuring out what we can do to be better at making software. Not just making software, but making better things for our customers, working better with other people, and just generally being better human beings. I work for this company in Omaha, Nebraska. You've never heard of it. We're a small software consulting company, but they are cool enough to let me come and do things like this, so they get a slide. 2020 and 2021 were a hell of a couple of years, weren't they? And then, 2021 came around, or 2022 came around, and basically told 2021 to hold its beer. And 2023 has just continued the nonsense, and as far as I can tell, the nonsense will continue more or less forever. It's just never going to stop. We've had to deal with a rapid addition of a bunch of new sources of stress. We've had to figure out how to do our jobs in new and interesting and exciting ways. We've lost a bunch of our support networks and our support structures that we relied upon. We've even had to deal with the constant threat of illness or even death. This is a video of an art installation that's in the Guggenheim. It's called Can't Help Myself. It is a 6-axis robot that they've installed a giant squeegee on, and it's constantly leaking hydraulic fluid out from its base, and it uses an optical sensor to kind of detect where the fluid is the highest, and it runs the squeegee back, so it's like constantly trying to scrub its own guts back toward itself. And I look at that after the last couple of years, and I'm just like, same, robot. That is a very big mood for this moment that we're in. But if you're feeling that way, you're not alone. More than 76% of people reported feeling burnt out during the pandemic. Of those, well over 2/3 reported that their burnout got worse as the pandemic went on, not better. In terms of 2022 stats, 59% self-rate their burnout as moderate or above. But it's not just the pandemic that did this to us. We've been burnt out for a while. This is from a Gallup poll from 2019 that says 76% of employees experience burnout at least sometimes in their job. But we have this misconception of what burnout is, this story that we've learned from popular culture and from the media, and it's wrong. And to help you understand that story, I would like you to meet Brad. Brad is a principal engineer at Initech. And he has been working very hard lately with a bunch of different teams trying to execute this company-wide process transformation. Now, he's had to do a lot of late hours, but it's okay because his spouse has been watching the kids. He has had to skip a number of leg days, though. But with some sweat and some tears and some blood, mostly not his, he got it done. And now he's taking his entire family for 2 weeks to Disney World. They're going to rest and recharge, and he's going to come back ready to hit the ground running. That's not what burnout is. That's what we think it is, but it's not what it is. Well, that kind of prompts the question, so what is burnout? Well, I can tell you a couple things it's not. Burnout is not a mental health diagnosis. It's not something that your therapist or your psychiatrist can diagnose you with. And it isn't just what psychologists call an affective experience either, which is to say it's not a strictly emotional experience. And it isn't simply exhaustion or depression, even though those factor in as major parts of burnout. Now, I'm kind of dancing around the question here. The real answer is that burnout is what they call a syndrome. And a syndrome is a sign of a set of medical conditions and signs and symptoms that correlate with each other. You might not think you know what a syndrome is, but I guarantee you've heard of at least one. Imposter syndrome. That's another syndrome. Okay, so what are these signs and symptoms? Well, it depends on who you ask. There are a number of different categorizations and characterizations of burnout. These are just the ones that I was able to find. There's certainly more that exist. And they all have a slightly different take on the progression of burnout and what it does to you and the process that's going on inside of your own mind. Burnout itself as a concept was popularized by Herbert Freudenberger in 1974 in his paper Staff Burnout, and then he wrote this best-selling book. We're going to be talking today about occupational burnout, which is to say burnout that's happening at your job. Now, let's go official for a second and look at the World Health Organization's definition of what burnout actually is. Burnout is a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. It is characterized by 3 dimensions: feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job, or feelings of negativism or cynicism about one's job, a sense of ineffectiveness and a lack of accomplishment. Now, I want to hone in on one part of this. Chronic workplace stress that has not been managed. The key thing about burnout is that it is a stress management problem. It arises from stress that has not been managed. That doesn't necessarily mean it's your fault that you are burnt out, but it means that you have more stress than you can conceivably handle. And then the definition goes on to say this only applies in an occupational context because they're specifically talking about occupational burnout. But what's it like to experience it? A dry definition is one thing, but what does it feel like? Well, I can tell you what it felt like for me. When I've been burned out, I feel like the only thing standing between my project and certain doom. I feel like the other people on my team cannot be trusted to execute the one right vision that I have in my head for how this software should work. I feel overwhelmed and unable to process other options. And if everybody just shut up and did what I said, then this would be fine. But I'm not the only person that's experienced burnout. Over the course, or when preparing for this talk, rather, I did a number of interviews with people, trying to get a broader sense of experience about what it's like to feel burnout. And I talked with people who repeatedly found themselves in the grips of burnout. I talked with people who found themselves juggling stress on multiple fronts, whether that was their work life, their home life, their social life. I talked with people who were stuck on dead-end projects, whether that was through the whims of office politics or simply through random fate. I talked with people who felt like they had to outperform their coworkers to keep pace. I talked to people who were overworked and burnt out to the point of physical symptoms. In fact, I talked with one person who experienced burnout so badly that he was actually experiencing seizures at work. But the most interesting thing that I learned over the course of these interviews was that everybody seems to find their own level of burnout. That you sink slowly down through the stages, through the progression of burnout, and you just find a place where you just kind of float there. You don't really get any worse, and you don't really get any better. And where that is for you seems to depend on your ability to manage that stress, and especially on externalities. On things like, do you have a spouse who can help you take care of the kids like Brad did? Do you have someone who can help you make food or get food on the table? Do you have someone that can manage the absolute nonsense of day-to-day life in 2023? If you do, you don't sink as far down into burnout. Now, burnout is typically measured using the Maslow Burnout Inventory, the MBI, the gold standard for how we measure burnout. And it measures burnout on 3 different axes, the first of which is emotional exhaustion. And they ask people questions like, do you agree with this statement? I feel used up at the end of the workday. I feel fatigued when I get up in the morning and I have to face another day on the job. Or I feel like I'm at the end of my rope. The second axis they use is depersonalization, where they ask questions like, I've become more callous toward people since I took this job. Or I worry that this job is hardening me emotionally. Or I feel like I treat some clients and coworkers as if they were impersonal objects. The last axis they use is personal accomplishment, and this one's inversely correlated with burnout. So, do you agree with the statement? I have accomplished many worthwhile things in this job. In my work, I deal with emotional problems very calmly. I feel like I'm positively influencing others' lives through my work. This is how they measure burnout. And what the MBI gives us is this picture of burnout as this multifaceted experience. It isn't simply being depressed. It isn't simply being tired. It isn't simply any one thing. It's this weird, terrible jewel of an experience. So how do you get there? How do you wind up with burnout? Well, it depends. Because there are a number of different categorizations and classifications for burnout, there's a bunch of different paths that people think you take to get there. We don't have time to dig into all of those or go into depth about the path through burnout, but I want to isolate and pull out what burnout looks like when you're on the slope downward. And it can start out very, very innocuously. If you start a new job, there's a completely natural response to want to say, I want to show them how good I am. I want to prove that I belong here, especially if you've gotten a huge pay bump on the way. The problem comes when that desire to prove yourself becomes a compulsion to prove yourself. And when that compulsion becomes deeper and you begin to feel this nagging discomfort and this intensity, and that desire becomes confused with conscientiousness, dedication, and commitment. Burnout is telling lies to yourself. If you're on the road to burnout, you will find yourself saying things like this: I know we're just bailing water on this project and not really solving any of the root problems, but we just have to make it past this release. Or, I don't really feel like I'm doing anything valuable at my job, but that'll change just as soon as I get this promotion I've been working for. In burnout, you lose the ability to distinguish between the essential and the inessential in your life. The past and the present, or past and the future, collapse into the present. You sever relations with them because there's nothing else beyond this moment and surviving through this moment. You deny your own human needs. And your thinking becomes rigid and inflexible. You lose the ability to tolerate ambiguity. You isolate yourself. And you stop seeing others as fully human. They become a means to an end, or they become obstacles. Emptiness overtakes you. You feel hollow, drained, and depleted. And at the end, burnout becomes completely enmeshed with your life. You live there now. That's who you are, is burnt out. And if you show up at your doctor's office or your therapist's office, you're more likely to get diagnosed with a mental health problem or a physical health problem than you are to be identified as a burnout case. Now, experiencing one or more of these doesn't actually mean you have burnout. I don't want to give you the false impression that you do. But on the other hand, even if you don't experience that full cycle, even if you don't make it all the way down to that full stage, you might still have burnout. Remember, we all kind of find our own level for this. But burnout is complex. It's that multifaceted experience. So let's look at some of the intersections, how burnout can intersect with things you're bringing to the table, your job is bringing to the table, and everything else in your life. Let's talk about how burnout intersects with your personality. How did you learn how to handle stress? Did you have someone teach you? Were you lucky enough to find a thing that works for you? If you don't have a stress management strategy, you're going to be more prone to burnout. If you are unable to manage stress, burnout's going to happen because that's what it is, unmanaged stress. Are you optimistic? The more optimistic you are, if you see the world through rose-colored glasses, you are less likely to experience burnout. Because you're able to see that this will pass. I just have to make it through this point, and you're actually right. But burnout obviously intersects with your job, so let's talk about that. That story of Brad and that concept of burnout as this overwork is one of the ways that you can get burnt out. Just simply a mismatch in workload, an inability to do what has been asked of you. But it can also come from a mismatch in control. You're being asked to change things, to affect things, to have an outcome that you can't actually change. There's a problem your customer's facing and you can't solve it for weird office politics reasons. Or the product you're working on will never work, but you're not able to switch off of it and you have to keep building it for weird office reasons. How many people here have ever written extensive unit tests for some product or feature that you know no one will ever use? Yeah, it's great, isn't it? It can also come from a lack of appropriate rewards. If you work on things and they're never going to take you where you want to go in your career, not just in terms of appreciation, but in terms of what you want to be doing, or managers who won't let you take on work that moves the needle for you personally, those are mismatches in rewards. It can also come from a lack of positive connections with others in the workplace. I can't imagine anything that's happened in the last couple of years that would cause this to happen, right? An endless cavalcade of Zoom calls. It can also come from a perceived lack of fairness or resources. If you are engaging with the same problem day after day after day after day, and you're never given the chance to fix it, if you have a support ticket filled with hundreds of duplicate tickets, and you just have to close each of them as won't fix, or you can't close them at all, that can lead to burnout. And lastly, it can come from a mismatch in values. And I don't mean this in some kind of actual political sense. I mean this in a very direct sense. If you care a lot about shipping software fast, getting value to the user, following CI/CD, and your company cares a lot about being correct engineering, and making sure that things are stable, neither one of you is 100% right. But if there's no agreement of what is valuable, you're going to have an extremely bad time at work. Now, here's the thing. Because burnout is not simply about how much you work, what that means is that you can get burnt out while only working 40 hours a week. You can get burnt out while working less than 40 hours a week. Because it's not simply about the amount of work you're throwing at it. One of the other topics I talk a lot about is mental health in tech for developers. So let's talk about how your mental health actually affects your chances of developing burnout. If you are a person who struggles with anxiety or depression, congratulations, you are basically set up for burnout out of the gate. Because those two things will really just trip you up. If you're the kind of person where your brain tends to work in cycles, this can create an I must get it done mentality when you're hitting one of your peaks. And that simply just makes you feel worse when you're at the bottom. If you've experienced traumatic experiences on a regular basis, burnout on a regular basis associated with particular experiences, that can form PTSD, because burnout can be very traumatic. And what that means is that then you experience that situation and your sympathetic nervous system just goes on full tilt and wants to flee or, punch your manager, which is probably not a great option. I had an extremely bad experience a number of jobs ago with working on an ETL system. And, full burnout. It was literally one of the things that drove me back into therapy. My current job asked me a number of years ago, hey, do you want to work on this ETL project? And I said, sure. It's been a number of years. I'm probably fine. My friends, I was not ready. I developed burnout far more rapidly than I thought I could actually, than I thought it could happen. To the point when I didn't believe I was burnt out. Your past experiences can drive this. Burnout can also intersect with everything else about you, the big ball of mess that is about being a human. If you feel the need to prove yourself, if you enter every job feeling like you have to do more just to measure up to your coworkers, you're already in the compulsion to prove. You start in burnout. And this can be true if you're a woman in tech or a person of color in tech. If you deal with constant stressors like implicit bias, that preloads your brain with stress. It's more stress that you have to manage, more things that you have to actually deal with. And if you get burnout, it can actually manifest differently. Herbert Freudenberger actually thought it was different enough, he wrote an entire separate book about it. Which is, very 70s, but it is legitimately different. Research shows that actually among men, if you get burnout, we have higher levels of depersonalization. And among women, it's a higher level of emotional exhaustion. It does manifest differently. So, all right, how do you get back out of it? You know, we're most of the way through the talk, and you finally the part you actually care about. How do you get out of burnout? Well, let's start with an unfortunate truth. Self-care is not going to fix your burnout. It can delay it, but it's not going to solve it. If you're in the dumpster fire, if you're in the throes of burnout, you can't meditate your way out of the dumpster fire. It's just not going to do anything. If you're luckier than I am, you take 6 to 8 months sabbatical and you just go find yourself and rest and recover. I know most of us are not that cool or special. But even though self-care isn't going to cure your burnout, it's certainly not going to help to not do it. How many people flew on an airplane to get here? Did you look at the seat back safety card? A couple of people do. I always do, because the designs are amazing. This is from the seat back card on an airplane, the safety card. And it's from the portion where the safety briefing where they talk about in the event of loss of cabin pressure, oxygen mask will drop from the ceiling. Place the mask in front of your face and reach the strap behind your head, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a portion in that where they talk about if you're traveling with a child or an infant or someone else who needs assistance, you put your own oxygen mask on first before you help that person. The reason you do that is because if you help your child instead of helping yourself first, you will pass out from lack of oxygen and then die, and they'll be fine, and they can't help you. Don't not do your self-care. Don't ignore your self-care, because self-care, whatever it is, whether that's exercise, whether that's meditation, hot yoga with goats, I don't know. Find the thing that works for you and do that thing, because it will help you manage the stress. The first real step to get out of burnout is to stop denying it, because we do this thing where we minimize our own experiences, where we tell ourselves, oh, it's fine, everything's okay, I'm not burnt out, because you want to stay in control of your own life. Newsflash, most of us are not in control of our own lives, and a lot of us are in burnout, and we're just not admitting it to ourselves. The first way to deal with your burnout is just to get a new job. Great, talk over, right? No. You need to look at this one with a little bit of skepticism, because this is the thing that people reach for instantly. But we just talked about a whole bunch of different ways in which your burnout could be coming from things that are not your job. If you find yourself getting burnt out at job after job after job, you are probably bringing something to the table. So if you do this, be careful. And you want to try and find worthwhile work. And I'm not making a value judgment here, but I want you to find something where both you and the people who employ you see value in what you're doing. The second way out of burnout is to establish work-life boundaries, because this is easy. How many people in this room got started programming before the age of 10? It's a fair number of us. If you got started that early, and even if you didn't, a lot of us can't separate who we are from what we do. We have no identity outside of our jobs. And what we found is that during the pandemic, that means that our jobs show up in our lives instantly. There's no pressure, there's no way to prevent that back pressure. You need to figure out who you are outside of your job. You need to break it down into transactions. What do you get from your job? What are you willing to give up to get that? A long time ago, I had a mentor in software. He taught me something that I found really valuable. And what he said, this phrase was, every 2 weeks, you and your employer are square. You owe each other nothing. Now, that isn't something I maintain all the time, but it is extremely useful to have that mindset in your back pocket and pull it out every once in a while and go, yeah, and assess whether you're getting what you need from this job. Because your job is not worth giving up time with your family, your friends, or your partner, ever. Full stop. The third way out of burnout is to seek involvement elsewhere, to do more work, which sounds a little counterintuitive. But if you know that burnout is not simply about overwork, then this makes sense. Go find something. If you can't change jobs and find something worthwhile, go find something else worthwhile to do that you can help with. And I don't mean like go start a nonprofit or go like join a board and become the CEO of this nonprofit. No, stop. You're just going to get yourself into burnout again. What I mean is go find something like Habitat for Humanity, where you can go swing a hammer for a weekend. And if you don't show up, it's okay. I mean, don't ghost them. That's not really cool. But they don't need you to make that house. There will be a bunch of other people there helping. Now, which of these ways you take is a personal choice. I can't tell you which one's going to be true or which one's going to be the best. But I encourage you to give yourself time to heal. As far as helping others, there's some things you can do as an individual to help yourself and others get out of burnout. First, normalize talking about it. Talk about burnout with your coworkers. Tear down hero culture. I don't mean tear down the heroes, but tear down the culture that required them to be that. If you ship a huge new feature and it required a bunch of personal sacrifice from your team, congratulations, you still failed. Point out burnout in others. Try to help them see what they can't, because we try to minimize that. And discuss external stressors with your team. If you talk about what is stressing you out in your life, whether that's mental, physical, emotional, coming from wherever. I mean, it could be just that the coffee shop down the road closed, whatever. Talk about that with your team, because it's real. Stress is real and it's happening to you, and it affects you and how you work. And if it affects how you work, it affects your team. Above all, I want you to be alert, to be aware, and to protect yourself. Thanks very much for listening. I hope you all stay safe out there. I think we're out of time for questions, but I will be at the conference for the rest of today and for tomorrow. So if you have any questions, please feel free to find me.
Thank you very much, Arthur.